Sophie has taken us through quite a massive section, and hopefully you're not feeling too intimidated about all these things that you might need to think about. But we wanted to help you think about, what does that actually look like in practice? This is about writing. How do you get some of this information down in an application form, which, as we know, often has very limited space. So we're going to give a worked example. I'm going to go back to the example that we used yesterday, which I will remind you of. So Sophie gave a list of the kinds of things that you'll be asked about. And one of the first ones is the study design. And this is a really good place to start. It sounds obvious perhaps to some of you, but it really helps to orientate your reader as to where your study is going. And it will be particularly helpful for any methodologists who will be reviewing your application, because some of those keywords will really help them to understand quickly where you're coming from. So a nice, simple statement, first of all, just briefly describing what your study design is really helpful. So a couple of examples here: a double-blind, parallel, randomized controlled study. That immediately clues in most of your reviewers as to exactly what they're expecting to come later. Or a prospective cohort study with nested qualitative study. So they will understand, okay, there are different parts to this, and I can look out for those different bits. So hopefully the relevance to the objectives that you've laid out for your research should be clear. If there's already, you think there might be questions in reviewers' minds about your choice of study design, whether that's because of the novelty of the approach, whether it is the most obvious, sort of almost self-explanatory that this is the kind of study design to use, or if there are limitations with that study design, you might want to head those off at the pass and give a little bit of explanation about those straight away. So to remind you of the example that Lisa presented yesterday, we ended up with a research question, which is, what is the effectiveness of motivational interviewing compared to usual care in uptake of pulmonary rehabilitation? So for this study, there were a variety of objectives. You may remember that there was an objective to refine the motivational interviewing intervention for use over the telephone. And so fairly obviously, that's a bit of intervention development work. Secondly, there was an objective to determine the effectiveness of using clinician-delivered motivational interviewing with respect to uptake and completion of pulmonary rehab amongst eligible patients. So hopefully a fairly obvious design for that is some kind of randomized controlled trial. Assess the fidelity of delivering the motivational interviewing. Well, that will be done also as part of the trial. Explore acceptability and perceived utility of motivational interviewing amongst patients and clinician. Okay, that's our exploration, the kind of stuff that Sophie has mentioned. That sounds more like some kind of qualitative work. So you might have a nested qualitative study as part of your overall package of research. And finally, to explore barriers and facilitators to delivering MI. Again, that will probably be most suited to some qualitative work. So now you've got laid out that you've got sort of a package of research that has a few different parts, and you can quite neatly put this into a reasonably succinct statement of what the study design is. For example, this study is a randomized controlled trial with nested qualitative study and prior intervention development. So that really helps signpost what you're going to be describing for your reviewers to understand. And you might decide that you want to put in some particular features. In this example, there is an element of an RCT. So you might want to talk about randomization. You might want to talk about treatment allocation or blinding, and you might want to have that in this description. You may decide that that can come later, and that would be fine too. So one of the other parts that Sophie mentioned was thinking about the setting and the sampling. So whatever kind of study design you have, whether that is qualitative, whether it is sort of quantitative, whether you're going to be recruiting people, even if you're using big data, you're still going to have to talk about these things. So although I'm going to be describing it for this example, this will still be relevant, whatever kind of study you are doing. So you should include some kind of reference to the setting of the recruitment of your data, whether that's participants or actual data, and how you're sampling. So it might be a community hospital in a certain place. If it's qualitative work, you might start talking about purposive sampling. So in this example, I'm focusing particularly on the RCT element and the fact that you're going to be recruiting actual patients into the study. So you need some kind of simple statement of the population of interest, and so you will have that, and you might want to support it with some eligibility criteria, inclusion and exclusion criteria, and that might look something like this for this example. So the population of interest are those who are referred to pulmonary rehab via any route. So you're trying to keep it as broad as possible. That might also feature in some of the stuff that Sophie was saying about research inclusion and trying to ensure that your research is as inclusive as possible, and that is baked into the design of your study. So you can see here there are a list of inclusion criteria and a list of exclusion criteria. And you can lay those out in bullet points. You don't have to be very flowery about it, just get that information out there. What you will notice is that on the fourth inclusion criteria, people do need to have a telephone. And the reason for that is this is a telephone intervention. So by absolute definition, the only way they can use this intervention is if they have a telephone and can be phoned on that to have the motivational interviewing. So that might have implications for research inclusion, and you might want to talk about why that's still justified in this study. But just to point that out, and we'll talk about research inclusion in much more detail tomorrow. So you've laid out who your population are. So your next question is, how are you going to recruit them into your study? What are the practical steps you need to take? So you will need to think about, how are you going to identify them? Once you've identified them, how are you going to screen them to ensure they really are eligible and are the right people to be in your study? Who's going to make initial contact with them, and how are you going to get consent for the study? And how does all of this fit in with what might usually happen to one of these patients? So it can be helpful to lay this out, and it's really helpful as researchers to think through this. It really is helpful to have these kind of frameworks, because it helps us to be really practical about the research we're trying to deliver. So we're going to identify them, all the people referred to participating programs. So that's just a referral list. Who's going to screen them? Well, actually, it's going to be the pulmonary rehab people who will do those screening and identify the telephone contact details. What's the initial contact? It's going to be a participant information sheet, and that's going to be sent by post. And who's going to do the consent? The consent will be audio recorded over the phone by a member of the research team. So I'm going to talk a little bit about actual recruitment. This is extremely thorny. It's really important that you are practical and realistic, and it is one of the major reasons that funding runs into difficulties once it's up and running. So it's something that reviewers will really look out for. And so it's important that you demonstrate in the way you describe it that you have thought of different eventualities. So just as you can see here, often as soon as you start a study, you suddenly find that all your participants have evaporated and things don't look quite as positive as you had planned for. So in this example, it's been worked out by your team statistician that the required sample size is 350 participants. And you think, great, we can do that. But actually, what's uptake from your participants going to be like? Well, you can look back in the literature and you might be able to say, well, previous work reported an uptake of 50% and a dropout of 20%. So actually, that means we have to massively inflate our numbers in order to get the 350 into our study. So that means we need to recruit 438 people to ensure that 350 of them make it to the end of the study, and we need to approach 876 people. So your numbers are beginning to go up a bit. So practically, how many sites do you need to get involved? So you might say, well, we see 150 people per year. So if we got 6 sites recruiting for 12 months, we'd hit our target. But that's people in general. What about once you've included all those eligibility criteria? What do those numbers then look like? Well, it now turns out that you see 100 eligible people per year. So then we'd need to get 9 sites recruiting for 12 months and we'd hit our target. But are all sites the same? So you might need to go off to different sites and find out their data as well. And it turns out that across the different sites, there's actually a mean of 70 eligible people per year, which means you might think, well, we'll get 11 sites, but recruit for 14 months, and then we'll hit our target. Getting even more practical, when will each site open for recruitment? Because you might not be able to get them all started exactly on day one. So you might end up with a really simple statement that says, with a staggered opening of 2 sites per month, we require 14 sites recruiting over 14 months. So look at these 2 different statements. One's significantly longer than the other, admittedly, but the first one suggests that you end up recruiting from 6 sites over 12 months. However, with a bit more digging and a bit more thought, you can see that with evidence backing up your claims, what you've actually decided as a research team is that you need 14 sites for 14 months, and you have put that in a really succinct statement in your application. So a reviewer might think, well, okay, they've had to inflate their numbers quite a lot, but that's practical, and they've given evidence as to why those are the numbers that they've ended up with. So that should satisfy a reviewer that you've been thoughtful and practical and realistic. So you've thought about your recruitment, you have described how you're going to identify, screen, make initial contact, and get consent from participants. So what happens now that a person is in your study? What are the processes? And how, again, does that fit in with current care pathways? Are you asking to do something really, really different for the sake of your research study? So you need to think about your study processes when you're collecting data and some of the other bits and pieces. And as Sophie has mentioned, flow charts can be really, really helpful to visualize what a study looks like, and can be a really efficient way of getting across some complicated information. So in this setting, we know that there's going to be some randomization. People are going to be allocated to either intervention or control treatment. There's going to be some follow-up where you do some data analysis, data collection, and then at the end of the study, there'll be some analysis. So thinking about how you describe some of the individual processes, we have already said that participants will be randomized to intervention or control, but how is that going to happen? When in the study process will that happen? And what is the ratio of your allocation to treatment to control? So you might want a slightly longer sentence that says following consent. So this is including people who've agreed to be in your study. Participants will be randomized to intervention or control in a 1-to-1 ratio using an online randomization service. So, okay, we know that there's online randomization, so we know how that's going to happen. Can we conceal allocation of treatment? Will there be blinding of anyone, participants, people collecting the data? Well, in this situation, that isn't possible. Your participants will know whether they've had a motivational interviewing phone call or not. So you can't blind that. So you just have to say that those collecting, that's not possible for either the participants or for the research team. But you might want to mitigate that because that might be seen as a bit of a flaw in your study. And so you might say, and you can see at the bottom of this statement, given the objective nature of the primary outcome, we do not envisage this biasing the results. So you might have to have some other features in your study to try and mitigate for some of the maybe less than ideal situation that you find yourself in. That, you know, it's just inevitable. Not research can't always be absolutely perfect. So we've mentioned the intervention and the control, and you will need to describe in a bit more detail what each of those are. You can't just assume that a reviewer will know what those things are. So we know that intervention is a motivational interview, but how does that happen? When does it happen? Who's going to deliver it? So we've got a couple of sentences to describe what that intervention is. So we know it's going to be delivered over the phone, and it says here by a trained healthcare professional. Consent for the call will be recorded, will be requested. And that harks back to that objective about fidelity checking. So by recording some of those sessions, a research member could have a listen and check that the motivational interviewing was delivered as intended. So they've got a backup that they will carry on with the intervention even if they're not allowed to record it. And they say that the interview will last between 15 and 20 minutes. So you might not be able to be very, very exact, but you should give an idea of what's involved. Similarly, for the control arm, you do need to describe that too. And often that will be some kind of version of what happens in current practice, usual care, but you do need to describe what that is. So here they have decided that the control arm will follow usual care, whatever that might be, in the participating sites. So that they're allowing for that to vary potentially, depending on the sites. But what they also say is that it might involve an appointment letter with or without an information pack. So you get a sense of kind of what's the minimum that usual care might be, what's the maximum that usual care might be. And that allows reviewers to make an assessment of how similar or different it is to the intervention arm. You will also be trying to convey what data you're collecting. And actually, this is a brilliant moment to just put in a table. It's another way of breaking up those big blocks of text, very visual, and whether that's part of your Gantt chart as some kind of upload, it's just a really quick way of getting across the information. So you can see here what happens in a screening visit, when you have your treatments, and when you have follow-ups, and where the end of the study is. And you can see all the different information that's being collected at each time points. It's, you know, it's not hugely exciting, but it's a very efficient way of getting across your information. And that can be very helpful to have in there. So you need to think in terms of your data collection. Can you justify everything that you're asking for? Or have you just said, well, it would be nice to collect this, and it would be nice to collect that, and it would be nice to collect the other? So you do need to make sure you really need this information. It's almost an ethical issue that you're not overburdening patients, you're not overburdening the research team for data that you may never analyse or may not be particularly relevant. So do think carefully that yes, you collect all the data you need, but you really can justify that it's worth doing it. And think about what methods or tools you're going to use that are the most suitable to answer your question, and how will you collect that data. So just a few thoughts, very brief thoughts, on what you might want to consider for your outcome measures. So are they going to answer your research questions? So here there's a few, because there's some research questions about efficacy. So have you got the right outcomes that really will show, has this worked? And in this case, it's quite simple, because you're just trying to see who goes on to take up the programme and stays in the programme. But you might be thinking, these measures, have they been validated by anyone in the past? Are they known to be reliable? In your area of work, what measures do other people use so that your research is comparable to others and can be compared with it? Do you have to think about how sensitive some of your outcomes are? Will they pick up the changes that you're hoping to see? Are they sensitive enough to do that? Is it actually feasible to collect them? Are they incredibly involved? Do they have high participant burden? So if you need your participant to go into hospital and have blood taken or something more involved, are they going to want to do that, or are they going to drop out of your study? So it's a mixture of, you know, practical considerations and scientific considerations. But all of this does need to be laid out, and you might need to talk about some of these features in your application so you can show reviewers you have thought all of this through. You might also have to think about regulatory or ethical considerations. So in this circumstance, as I've said, the primary outcome measure is whether the pulmonary rehab was taken up. We've got some secondary measures which are specific to COPD, and as is often the way, you might collect something about adverse events. And again, this is geared towards this study, which is an RCT, but you will have the equivalent, even if you have a qualitative study. You will also be talking about what's the data you're collecting and how are you going to analyze it. So for your data analysis, you will need to outline the steps of your data analysis plan. If you're using particular methods, you should say why that is and explain how they're going to answer your research question. And again, this is where you pull in your methodologists to help you write these sections and really show that they know what they're talking about. So for here, this will be a matter of summarising your data, the number of people in the treatment group and the control group who did or didn't take up the intervention. You may do a formal statistical test to see if those proportions are different from each other, and you might calculate an effect size, so some kind of risk difference or an odds ratio. And often you'll calculate confidence intervals as well. So all of those things are important to describe. You also need to think about project management. So that's a slightly different thing. Again, that very practical aspect. So what is your team structure? What roles are they taking on? How do they all work together? Will you have monthly team meetings to keep everyone updated and ensure that the project is on track? You'll probably put in some kind of Gantt chart that does show the study timelines and milestones. You might want to think in particular about how your public contributors will be involved in the study as it goes on, and are there going to be meetings that they are involved in there? What kind of monitoring do you need to do as the study progresses? And thinking about the description of your research plan when you have a project which has a number of different parts like this one does, you will have to take a view. Is it easier to describe all of these different things for one bit and then move on and do all the same for a second bit? Or do you try and do all of the recruitment bit and then all of the data collection bit and all of the analysis bit? So you might have to take a view, what flows better, what's clearer in how you describe it. For this study here, you'd probably do the intervention development and all of the description of that bit, then talk through the RCT and maybe talk about the nested qualitative study completely separately, but go through all of these same stages. So just as a summary, we've talked about the design, how that can be a really important signal that really helps reviewers get oriented as to what you're doing and what they expect to see you writing about. Think about the people who are in your study, how you're going to get them into your study and how you're going to keep them there, what will happen to them once they're in your study, and what are you going to do with the data and what will you do with the results. And you may also have a bit about dissemination, which we will talk about later on.